As the war in Ukraine drags on, the once formidable Russian arsenal is getting whittled down, one tank, one missile, one outdated rifle at a time. And with sanctions squeezing the economy and the supply lines running dry, it seems like Putin's big push to demilitarize Ukraine is leading to something else entirely: the unintentional demilitarization of Russia itself. Welcome to the bizarre reality where a former superpower is quite literally dismantling its own military strength. This video explains how. Let's start with the basic premise of demilitarization. Demilitarization is essentially the process of dismantling a country's military capabilities. It's the opposite of militarization. Instead of building up an army, you're scaling it down, sometimes drastically. Often it follows a major conflict or a peace agreement, making it the cool-down phase after the heat of the war. Now, demilitarization can take many forms. One of them, arguably the broadest, is imposing arms control measures. These measures are typically aimed at limiting the development, production, and use of weapons, whether small arms or weapons of mass destruction. The idea behind these measures is to restrain military capabilities, thus preventing escalation and reducing the chances of future conflicts. Notable examples include the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, which imposed limits on the size of navies, and the more recent Chemical Weapons Convention, which banned entire categories of destructive weapons. Another method of demilitarization is closing military bases. This isn't just about disposing of physical buildings, it's about removing the infrastructure that supports a country's ability to mobilize and deploy forces. After World War II, Japan and Germany saw many of their bases dismantled or repurposed under Allied occupation. Without bases, the nerve centers of any military operation, armies struggle to organize and respond, making them far less effective in any future conflict. A more drastic form of demilitarization is disbanding the country's armed forces. Some countries take it to the extreme, like Costa Rica, which famously abolished its military in 1949. In Costa Rica's case, the decision was voluntary and peaceful, but historically, this form of demilitarization has also been imposed on defeated nations. Take the aftermath of World War I as an example. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to reduce its army to just 100,000 men. To understand just how massive this reduction was, consider that 13.6 million Germans served in the country's armed forces between 1914 and 18. That's a 99.3% reduction. The goal of this move was to prevent Germany from becoming a military threat again, though history shows how that eventually turned out. A more successful example is post-World War II Japan, where the once formidable Imperial Army, which had over 6 million troops in 1945, was dismantled, and the country was forbidden from maintaining an aggressive military force. Japan has since focused on self-defense rather than expansion, a direct result of the forced demilitarization. And then there's the removal or destruction of weapons. This is demilitarization in its purest, most visible form, physically dismantling the machines of war. Tanks, fighter jets, submarines, entire fleets of military hardware are scrapped or reduced. After World War I, for instance, Germany had to destroy its entire air force. This wasn't just about taking planes out of the sky, it was about cutting off the means to quickly rearm an attack. Similarly, many countries that signed on to arms control treaties have had to destroy stockpiles of weapons, from missiles to chemical agents. What's happening to Russia today, though, is a different story. It's a kind of accidental demilitarization driven not by treaties, but by the brutal reality of a prolonged conflict. The longer the war in Ukraine drags on, the more Russia finds itself becoming progressively disarmed through sheer attrition. But let's dig deeper into this unintentional demilitarization. To really understand the process, let's break it down in the same format we just discussed. Through arms control measures, the closing of military bases, disbanding of armed forces, and the removal or destruction of weapons. Each of these forms of disarmament is playing out in Russia in one way or another, weakening its military power. Let's start with the arms control measures. In Russia's case, arms control is not being implemented through traditional arms control treaties, but rather through relentless pressure of international sanctions. These sanctions are acting as a de facto form of arms control, suffocating Russia's ability to produce, develop, or acquire new military technology. You see, since the initial invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the European Union, along with other global powers like the US and the G7 partners, have imposed a total of 15 sanctions packages targeting the heart of Russia's war machine. The sheer scale of these restrictions is staggering. Over $52 billion worth of goods that could have been exported to Russia are now completely embargoed. This includes everything from cutting-edge technology to dual-use goods, items that might have civilian uses but are crucial to Russia's military efforts. Think advanced semiconductors, drones, encryption devices, and high-tech industrial equipment. These are the very components needed to keep Russia's most advanced weapon systems operational and rolling off the production line. Then on the import side, the story is just as bad for Russia. Almost $100 billion in goods that the country once shipped out to the EU have been blocked. In total, that's 54% of exports and 58% of imports, now 7. Imagine trying to fight a war when more than half of your trade lines have been cut off. But it doesn't end there. The sanctions have hit nearly every aspect of Russia's industrial and military infrastructure. We're talking about banning the export of critical goods like aircraft parts, maritime navigation equipment, and even fuel for jets. Without those supplies, Russia is losing its ability to maintain its fleet of planes, helicopters, and ships. Plus, without access to Western parts and technology, Russia is forced to rely on outdated equipment or cobble together makeshift alternatives, which are often far less effective. And it's not just weapons and vehicles that are affected. Military technology itself is under siege. Items like quantum computers, specific types of software, and even components for radio communications are all on the embargo list. The impact of Russia's drone capabilities alone is worth mentioning. Thanks to the sanctions, Russia is struggling to keep its drone programs running. The EU and its partners have banned the export of drone engines, software for these unmanned aerial vehicles, and other key tech that Russia needs to produce or operate high-quality drones effectively. Without access to these components, Russia's drone warfare, once a growing strength, has taken a massive hit. Russia may have ramped up drone production, but the 35,670 destroyed FPV drones and an additional 1,140 strike drones confirmed to have been lost show how quickly technology can become obsolete on the battlefield. And if you think Russia can turn to other nations to source this technology, think again. The US, Japan, Canada, and Australia are also part of these sanction efforts, creating a near-global chokehold on Russia's ability to acquire military goods. The countries willing to work with Russia, like China, Iran, and North Korea, don't have the same proven track record in terms of military technology. Now you might ask, what about Russia's oil and gas industries, the backbone of its economy? Historically, these sectors have provided a financial cushion for Russia, allowing it to absorb economic blows while still funding its military. But this is where the sanctions have targeted hardest. The EU has banned 90% of oil imports from Russia, which is absolutely devastating for Moscow. Before the sanctions, half of Russia's total oil exports were going to the EU. In 2021, the EU alone imported over $77 billion worth of oil from Russia. Now, that market is essentially gone. The loss of these revenues isn't just a blow to Russia's economy, it's directly undermining its ability to sustain military operations. And there's more. The sanctions aren't only focused on limiting Russia's immediate access to military goods, but are also designed to cripple its long-term industrial capacity. The EU and its partners have cut Russia off from critical global financial networks, particularly the SWIFT financial messaging system that's used for making almost all transactions between banks globally. This has made it nearly impossible for Russian businesses, especially those tied to the military, to secure funding from outside Russia. The EU has blocked $300 billion worth of assets from Russia's central bank, effectively freezing a third of Moscow's foreign reserves. This is a long-term strategy aimed at ensuring Russia's economy and, by extension, its military, doesn't just stumble, but completely crumbles over time. When you add all of this up, it's clear that these sanctions are doing much more than hurting Russia's economy currently. They're systematically dismantling its ability to wage war. Without access to advanced technology, vital industrial materials, and crucial financial resources, Russia's military capacity is shrinking. The result? Unconventional arms control, which limits Russia's ability to replenish and modernize its military arsenal, rendering its forces increasingly obsolete on the battlefield. Another form of demilitarization has to do with the country's military bases. Now, this might be the most unorthodox form of demilitarization we'll discuss, but stick with us. It will all make sense soon. On August 14, 2024, Ukraine shook the foundations of Russian military might with its largest long-range drone strike yet. 4 key Russian airfields were targeted in Voronezh, Kursk, and Nizhny Novgorod, with strikes that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky described as timely and accurate. The main goal? To hit warehouses storing aviation weapons and fuel. By targeting these facilities, Ukraine is undermining Russia's ability to wage war from the skies. But these airfields aren't just patches of tarmac, they're the beating hearts of Russia's aerial operations. To every aircraft, every logistics line, and every command post, these bases are nothing short of indispensable. When Ukraine strikes, it's like pulling the plug on Russia's aerial firepower. With fewer operational airfields, Russia's capacity to launch airstrikes, gather intelligence, and transport troops is severely crippled. And the results speak for themselves. Since the drone strikes, the number of guided bomb attacks on Ukrainian border settlements has dropped. That's a direct result of targeting these military bases. But it's also just the beginning. As of late August 2024, Ukraine has 16 Russian air bases within range of its ATACMS missiles. Each strike on these critical installations means Russia has less capacity. Every hit is a step toward demilitarization. The ripple effect has been astounding. Russian troops have been forced to move 90% of their bombers away from these bases. Plain and simple, they're scrambling. This isn't just a tactical shift, it's a fundamental change in how Russia operates. Russian commanders must now weigh the risks of launching operations against a constantly looming threat. The fear of further strikes compels Russia to redeploy its forces, often to less effective positions. The vulnerability of these bases has forced Russia to empty them out, moving planes, weapons, and equipment to other bases deeper into Russia, making them more difficult and costly to deploy. This makes Ukraine's strategy of targeting Russian military bases a stroke of enforced demilitarization brilliance. This brings us to the more obvious form of demilitarization taking place in Russia, the unintentional disbanding of the country's armed forces. This form is also the most outright shocking of them all. Why? Because Russia's armed forces are being decimated on the battlefield. That's how they're shrinking, and it's all the Kremlin's fault. Let's start with the figures, which are horrific, to say the least. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, from February 24, 2022, the onset of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, to January 2025, Russia lost approximately 790,000 troops. Yep, that number includes 1,450 casualties in just one day before the report, reflecting the relentless attrition that Russian forces face. Now, it's important to note that not all of these soldiers are killed. The number accounts for both losses due to death and severe injury. Still, the human toll is absolutely staggering. The reality is that Russia is bleeding. The worst part? Russia itself is to blame for these jaw-dropping statistics. How so? Well, that's precisely how the Kremlin views its soldiers, as just numbers, statistics. That's why they're being sent into battle with little regard for their safety, and the carnage has been unimaginable so far. Russia has started relying heavily on a brutal meat grinder tactic, where commanding officers throw wave after wave of soldiers into the fray, seemingly indifferent to their fates. It's kind of the Russian way of war, as a senior US military official described it. The Pentagon estimates average losses of over 1,600 to 2,000 soldiers per day, exceeding previous peak daily rates. However, the recent push in the Donetsk region involved sending small infantry units in waves, creating a target-rich environment for Ukrainian forces. It's a grim spectacle. Thousands are sent into the maw of war, each step taken with little more than the hope of overwhelming enemy defenses. It's disgraceful, it's shocking, it's effectively destroying the Russian troops. But despite these staggering losses, the Kremlin hasn't had enough. That's why it's still scrambling to replenish its forces. According to estimates from June 2024, Russia recruits between 25,000 and 30,000 new soldiers each month. However, this frantic recruitment barely keeps pace with the troops exiting the battlefield. Sure, the Russian population of approximately 144 million gives the Kremlin a large pool of potential recruits, but this advantage is squandered by the ongoing slaughter. And yet, to avoid a mass mobilization, which would be deeply unpopular domestically, Russia has resorted to desperate measures. Putin is attempting to incentivize voluntary enlistment with sizable bonuses. Russia's draft budget for 2025 to 27 allocates $315 million for these bonuses, which can be as high as 22 times the monthly wage in Russia. Of course, the promise of better pay and perks is a feeble attempt to cover up the grim reality that many of these new soldiers are sent into battle poorly trained and ill-equipped. Basically, they're sent there to die. As the body count on the Ukrainian battlefield rises, the loss of experienced soldiers is becoming particularly detrimental. The elite and professional soldiers, along with the junior officer corps, are taking the brunt of these casualties. The void left by these veterans is filled by the hastily trained recruits we've just mentioned, leading to a critical erosion of military effectiveness. But the long-term effects are more troubling for Russia. The very structure of the Russian armed forces has been irrevocably changed, as nearly 90% of pre-war troops were lost by the end of 2023. These figures include many of Russia's most elite units, which are now decimated. What remains are the inexperienced recruits, foreign nationals, prisoners, and mercenaries from groups like Wagner. This isn't just a military in disarray, it's a grotesque farce. The composition of the Russian armed forces alone raises serious questions about the effectiveness and morale of these hastily assembled units. To add insult to injury, the Kremlin's methods are becoming more coercive in a desperate bid to bolster troop numbers. So tactics like the stop-loss policies prevent soldiers from resigning at all, Others make sure that the injured soldiers are dragged right back to their units. These shameful policies can only lead to the slow, painful disbanding of the Russian armed forces. After all, there are only so many soldiers that can be pushed into the meat grinder before the inevitable collapse occurs. Speaking of collapse, that's precisely what's happening to Russia's weapons arsenal. In a bitter twist of irony, Moscow is waging war against itself, with weaponry that was once a source of pride now becoming a testament to failure. But how big of a failure are we talking about? We'll let the numbers speak for themselves. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russia lost 9,714 tanks, 20,205 armored fighting vehicles, 21,729 artillery systems, and 369 airplanes by January 8, 2025. But this isn't just a numbers game. It's a dismantling of a military machine that once seemed indomitable. Consider the tank losses alone. Russia was once the disputed world champion of armored warfare, boasting the largest tank fleet on the planet, and by a margin. But now, according to Ukraine, nearly 9,000 of these tanks are gone, destroyed, damaged, abandoned, or captured. To understand just how massive this number is, all you need to know is that no other country possesses 9,000 tanks in total. According to the Global Firepower Index, North Korea possesses 5,845, Egypt 5,340, and China 5,000. With 4,657 tanks, the US is at number 5. Among the losses, the erasure of the T-90M tank is particularly notable. Why? Because this model was hailed as the most advanced tank in the Russian arsenal and was supposed to be a formidable adversary on the modern battlefield. And yet it's getting absolutely wrecked on the Ukrainian battlefield. At least 111 of these tanks have been lost so far, and we're only talking about the documented losses. With every new hit, a piece of military history gets swallowed by the mud of Ukraine before our very eyes, and it doesn't stop at tanks either. According to Ukraine, as of January 8, 2025, the Russians have also lost at least more than 4,708 infantry fighting vehicles, with more than 3,548 of those completely destroyed. Again, these are just the pictured losses. Among these are 1,386 BMP-2s and 824 BMP-1s, vehicles that once formed the backbone of infantry support. This devastating equipment attrition isn't just a blip on the radar, it's a signal of a deeper malaise within the Russian military. As the war continues, Putin's forces are increasingly forced to rely on outdated equipment. They're pulling relics from the past, dragging Soviet-era machinery back into service. It's akin to watching a once mighty gladiator now armed with rusty weapons and shaky armor, an embarrassment on the world stage. In the face of these overwhelming losses, Russia's defense industry is scrambling to catch up. Reportedly, civilian factories are transitioning into producing military hardware, but the results are less than reassuring. Why? Because quality has been sacrificed at the altar of quantity, a tale Russia knows all too well. Sure, production lines are churning out drones, artillery shells, and other military supplies, but are they reliable? Can these hastily assembled weapons truly stand up to the rigors of battle? With 40% of the federal budget set aside for military expenditure in 2025, the Kremlin's commitment is clear. However, the effectiveness of these new weapons on the battlefield is questionable, to say the least. Plus, there's the China issue. You see, 70% of the machine tools and 90% of the microelectronics that Russia needs are now sourced from China. Given China's nature, this dependency is a double-edged sword. Sure, it allows Russia to maintain a semblance of military might. However, it also creates a tenuous situation where any disruption to supply chains could leave the military crippled, and the Russian military genuinely can't afford this. The additional numbers tell a story of despair. 33,307 vehicles and fuel tanks lost, 1,260 multiple launch rocket systems, and 1,038 air defense systems up until January 2025. The relentless destruction of Russian weapons is now a form of demilitarization in itself. The more the country loses, the more its military structure crumbles. With 28 ships and boats lost at sea, including 21 utterly destroyed, the Russian Navy is facing a crisis. The Black Sea, once a stronghold, has become a battleground where Russian vessels are targeted mercilessly. Air power, once a significant aspect of Russian military strategy, is also faltering, with 114 aircraft confirmed destroyed, including Su-25s and Su-34s. The skies are becoming increasingly hostile for Russian pilots. Helicopters too are falling from the sky, 114 of the confirmed 145 forever lost. The 61 Ka-52 Alligator attack helicopters, once feared, now serve as grim reminders of how quickly the mighty can fall. What remains of the Russian military arsenal now is a patchwork quilt of the old and the new, stitched together with desperation. But for how long will this quilt hold? The total destruction of this arsenal is slowly underway, with each destroyed piece of equipment a nail in the coffin of what was once believed to be a superpower. But let's ask you this. It seems obvious that Russia is destroying itself from within, with the accidental demilitarization being just one glaring symptom of a deeper rot. But will this self-inflicted destruction go all the way? Will Russia's war machine cannibalize itself completely? Or do you see any faint prospect of the Russian military rising from the ashes? After all, Russia is known to show resilience in the face of unprecedented adversity. Share your insights in the comments section below. Now go and check out how Russia lost the biggest tank battle of the war, or click this other video instead.